Tales of children living in the wild, surviving with the wild, have fascinated and haunted us for centuries. Like Romulus and Remus, mythical twins raised by a she-wolf, and the legendary Tarzan of the Apes. These wild children learn the ways of the jungle, the language of their adopted family, and survive for years away from all human contact. But are these stories fact or fiction? Could a child actually survive alone in the forest? Would animals really care for, rather than eat, a human baby? And left in the wilderness, does a child forget his human origins and become a wild beast? We'll have experts in the fields of psychology and animal behavior examine the world's most compelling cases. From a boy in Uganda who lived with monkeys, to a girl in the Ukraine raised among dogs, and an Australian woman said to run with kangaroos. Join skeptics and believers alike as we investigate the world of feral children to discover, is it real? Imagine a baby alone in the woods. How would he eat? Where would he sleep? As humans, we come into this world completely helpless. Mostly, we just know how to breathe and cry. Animals, on the other hand, stagger to their feet within minutes of birth and begin to take on the world. Animals instinctively know how to get nourishment from their mothers. Life can be a struggle, and only the fittest survive. But while kids and animals do have some things in common, the fact is a human child is ill-equipped to face the world on its own. So take away a parent and the comforts of home. Could a child survive in the wild? And is it possible that in the absence of mom, a nurturing monkey will step in? That's what we're asked to believe in stories of so-called feral children, children living in the wild, often with the help of animals. But are these stories real?
Would I rule it out? No, it may be possible, it may have been possible, it may have happened.
My gut instinct is to say some are probably real and some are not.
Although rare, tales of feral children appear all over the world. Oksana Malaya, known as the Ukrainian dog girl, lived for years with a pack of dogs. In South Africa, a boy named Lucas allegedly spent his childhood in the care of a troop of baboons. Or there's Amala and Kamala, Indian girls who local police found sleeping together in a wolf den. These stories are intriguing and oddly compelling, but what exactly are we dealing with?
The word feral has many different meanings, but here we're using it in the sense of children who either reared themselves without human companionship, or more likely were reared by some form of animal.
Dr. Douglas Canlon has studied the phenomenon of feral children and their alleged interaction with wild animals. He's examined hundreds of reported cases. Most, he says, rely on eyewitness accounts and have certain common elements.
We all said the child had no recognizable speech. The child did not like to eat cooked food. The child walked on all fours. So, quite properly, people were saying, this is a wild child.
But just how reliable are these accounts? We'll examine one of the most compelling cases in modern history. It began in Africa. Kampala, Uganda, home to over 1 million people who, like most city dwellers, find the bump and grind of just getting to work a little tricky. But one wrong turn on these dusty roads could lead to some of the world's thickest jungles. 2 hours south of Kampala, Bombo village teeters on the edge of Africa's untamed forests. It was here in Bombo in 1991 that a remarkable story emerged. A woman walking home through the African brush was startled by a group of vervet monkeys chattering in the trees. The monkeys were a common sight around the outskirts of the village, stealing food and bothering the locals. But as she watched them that day, the woman caught a glimpse of something that terrified her. A dark form crouching in the branches. But this was nothing to be afraid of. This was a human boy. Once the woman realized what she'd seen, she went back into the jungle and brought him into her home. News of the strange boy spread like wildfire. And while the local villagers felt sorry for the child, they weren't quite sure what they were seeing.
Everybody came to see the new boy, who had hair all over, and he had no toe. The toe was bitten by monkeys.
The kids in the village recall that when the boy first arrived, he was as wild as an animal.
He could scratch you like you are not a human being. You know how a cat does? He could scratch you like a cat.
They decided this boy must have been in the forest for a while. They said he hated to be kept indoors, wouldn't eat cooked food, and didn't like clothes. The boy wouldn't or couldn't talk, but he seemed to be able to communicate with the vervets and even moved like the monkeys.
He was moving like this, just like a monkey.
Pretty soon, the locals were calling him a real-life Tarzan, the fictional boy who grew up in the jungle.
Whoa! Whoa! We were wondering, what kind of guy is this? It was really amazing to see such a guy making noise of an animal.
So who was this mysterious feral child? In time, local authorities identified him as John Sabunya, a 4-year-old missing from a nearby village. John had disappeared into the forest a year earlier. To this day, the villagers believe it was the monkeys that helped this defenseless child to survive alone in the wild. This is a romantic notion, but is it real? Perhaps the only way to find out is to track down John Sabunya himself and see what he remembers. We'll do that a little later. When it comes to stories of feral children, it's often hard to separate fact from fiction. Most of the cases occur in remote areas where the details are poorly documented. And then there's the media. Stories of children raised by animals make for great tabloid copy and sensational headlines. The details get lost in the storytelling to satisfy an audience thrilled by news of the weird. And many turn out to be pure fabrication. Take this case in Australia. Although strictly speaking, it involves not a child, but a young woman. Eucla is a tiny outpost on the coast of Western Australia. It's not the kind of place you'd expect to make headlines. But in the 1970s, a strange story began to make the rounds. A couple of hunters said they spotted a half-naked young woman running with a pack of kangaroos.
She was blonde, not too tall, medium size, but nice developed.
The rumor spread, and curious sightseers flocked to Eucla in search of the kangaroo girl. A busload of tourists caught a glimpse of her. Then a local photographer caught her on film. The locals nicknamed her the Nullarbor Nymph, and the media had a field day. So was this a woman gone walkabout with ruse? Or was someone having some fun? It was, of course, a hoax. The story was the brainchild of 4 drinking buddies who thought that Eucla, a town of 50, could use a bit of publicity.
We had a chance to introduce our secluded place to the whole world.
So they dressed up a local girl in kangaroo skins and made up the whole story. As the tour buses came into town, The boys cued the kangaroo girl.
And then Denise ran across the road.
All in all, a harmless bit of deception.
Nobody was hurt. Nobody died. No kangaroo got killed. So why not make a nice story?
The perpetrators of the kangaroo girl hoax capitalized on the fact that people are drawn to stories of the shocking and sensational. It was pure fiction, but people bought it. So what about other famous stories of feral children? Could they be real? Among the many reported cases, there are a handful that deserve a closer look. Perhaps the most carefully documented account of a feral child took place in southern France at the turn of the 19th century.
Once there was a child left to himself in the woods.
In this 1970s movie trailer, from world-famous director François Truffaut's film Wild Child, we see a dramatization of Victor of Aveyron, based on eyewitness accounts of the day.
Proof of the animal in all of us.
On a cold morning just a few days into the year 1800, the citizens of a southern French village awoke to see a wild-looking boy who appeared from the nearby woods. Villagers claimed to have glimpsed him before, and local legend had it he'd been living in the woods from an early age. This winter had been particularly bad, so perhaps the boy was drawn to the village looking for something to eat. Eventually, the boy was taken in by a budding psychologist, Dr. Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard, who gave him the name Victor. Like John Sabunia, Victor couldn't communicate with humans. He disliked clothes, wouldn't eat the food they prepared him, and seemed to prefer the outdoors. We know a lot about Victor because his rehabilitation was closely followed by the leading scientists of the day, embroiled in an old and fundamental debate, namely, what it means to be human. Essentially, will a child raised in the wild become a man or a beast? Will a boy living with wolves end up a wolf? Or is he hardwired to be human? Basically, are we the product of nature or nurture? The idea of children raised by animals has been part of our culture for centuries. Perhaps the most famous example in ancient myth was that of Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. These twin infants were the progeny of Mars, the god of war, and a beautiful priestess who was supposed to be a Vestal virgin. When her sin was discovered, the local king ordered her newborns killed. Luckily, a servant took pity and instead sent the infants downriver, where a she-wolf rescued the twins and took them home to raise. Evidently, this wolf did a great job because the boys made good and went on to found one of the greatest cities in the history of man.
Out of the jungle comes Tarzan.
But it is perhaps in literature and film that the concept of feral children really catches fire. Based on a 1912 novel by Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan of the Apes has transcended time to become one of the best-loved cinematic icons of all time. What child doesn't want to live in the jungle, swinging through the trees with an ape by his side, yodeling at the top of his lungs?
He grew up with the cubs. They called him Mowgli.
Mowgli, the hero of Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, is another children's favorite. Mowgli is a little boy in India raised by wolves who must learn the law of the jungle if he is to survive.
What can a man cub do when he wants to run with a pack?
But in fact, these somewhat antiquated stories reveal more about the society of the day than we perhaps realize. For centuries, people had been debating the question of man's place in the natural world. Essentially, what it means to be human. For many, religion had defined mankind as created in God's image, which put us well above the beasts of the land. But then science threw a monkey wrench into the whole thing. A guy named Charles Darwin tried to convince us we had evolved from common ancestors shared with apes. This raised some very disturbing questions. Was man in fact nothing more than a smart animal? Take away the influence of society and education, would a human still be human? raise a boy in the jungle away from all human contact, and would he become a man or a wild beast? In literature, at least, the wild child made good. Tarzan grows into a noble savage, endowed with impeccable values and a sense of justice.
New leader will be the man Mowgli.
Mowgli masters the animal kingdom by learning the laws of the jungle and using his human wits. But what about the real world? Dr. Adriana Benzaken, author and Mount St. Vincent University professor, believes the driving force behind the scientific interest in feral children centers around the old debate of nature versus nurture.
Some scientists believe that to study human nature, you had to somehow peel everything that had been added by society, by education, and get to the core, get to the natural man. How could you do that?
Obviously, there's one way to do it. Take a child, deprive it of any human contact, and see how it develops. Of course, the problem is, you'd have to take a child and deprive it of any human contact, which is in any man's world illegal, never mind unconscionable. The very idea became known as the forbidden experiment. But then scientists realized there was another option: cases of feral children.
Children who by accident had been taken away from society and had grown in isolation from society. Some people believe that by studying such cases, you could really see what was natural about human beings and what in a human being is social or is acquired.
Victor of Aveyron walked out of the woods at the very height of this debate.
In the case of Victor of Aveyron, we have reports of sightings of him dating from at least a year before his definitive capture. There is a strong possibility that he had been living that way for at least 3 years and perhaps longer.
Here then was an apparently genuine case of a child, about 12 years old, cut off from society and living in the wild. So what exactly was this boy? Was he a natural man? Or had he devolved into an animal? Was he a product of nature or nurture? If Itard and the public were expecting a noble savage, they were sorely disappointed. Victor was no Tarzan. As Truffaut's film conveys, the boy remained wild and uncontrollable. Most troubling of all, while he clearly understood some words, Victor never really developed human speech. How was society going to get the answers it wanted if the boy couldn't tell them? Itard's frustration grew as the boy seemed not to respond, and Itard's critics became increasingly hostile. In the end, he gave up, and Victor spent the rest of his life in an institution. But Victor, it seems, had started a trend.
The interest in these stories somehow breeds more stories.
By the early 20th century, cases of children allegedly raised by animals were appearing throughout the world. Many of these stories came from India. Perhaps it had something to do with the popularity of Kipling's Jungle Book stories, because the animal of choice in these cases was usually a she-wolf.
The arrival of a wolf child caused as much surprise as the daily delivery of milk, because there were so many cases that were showing up one after another.
The most famous of these stories emerged from northern India. In 1920, a missionary traveling through the Bengal jungle was shocked to discover 2 infant girls living among a pack of wolves. As the story goes, Reverend Singh mounted a rescue mission to save the children, in the process killing their adopted wolf mother. Reverend Singh brought the girls back to the orphanage he and his wife ran in Midnapur, determined to give these little wolf children a good Christian upbringing. The younger, Amala, didn't survive, and with Kamala, progress was slow. Singh kept a journal which describes what you might expect from a child raised by wolves. She couldn't talk, walked on all 4s, ate raw meat, scratched at the door to be let out. It took years, but Reverend Singh and his wife claimed to have educated Kamala to behave as a human. The scientific community learned of Kamala's case in the late 1920s, when the story hit the British news. Sadly, by that time, Kamala had died of cholera. For decades, scientists debated, were Singh's tales of the wolf girls true? The one person who could have told them was Kamala herself. But like Victor, she never learned to speak. And it seems this is a common theme. Few, if any, wild children are reported to ever learn language. Scientists now believe that nearly all babies are born with the capability to learn to speak. But in order to master language, they have to hear it during their formative years. For Victor of Aveyron and for Kamala, that window of opportunity may have closed during their time away from human contact. The same appears to be true of John Sabunya in Uganda. Although the facts of his early childhood are unclear, it appears the boy was in the wild, away from human contact, for a period between 6 months to a year. When the young child was brought out of the jungle and into the Ugandan village as a frightened wild boy, he too had trouble making himself understood.
When he was annoyed, he used to make a lot of noise, crowing like an animal. His behaviors were different from ours. And then we wanted to know how is this boy communicating. He never knew how to speak, really.
So did John ever learn to speak? And if so, what, if anything, could this boy remember from his time alone in the jungle? No one seems to know exactly how long John Sabunya lived in the Ugandan wilderness before he was rescued. What is clear, however, is that during his time in the jungle, isolated from all human contact, he seemed to have lost the ability to communicate with people. Shortly after John was rescued by the village woman, he was taken to an orphanage run by a Ugandan couple, Molly and Paul Waswa, who at any given time have up to 1,000 children under their care. Molly, who had several children of her own, admits John was, well, different from her other children. Molly recalls the villagers' first impressions of John.
People were surrounding him, he looked like some people wanted to have a look at him and laughing at him and thinking that he's a monkey boy. They told him he's half human and half animal.
At first, Molly says the idea of keeping John in her household was shocking.
I said, oh my God. I told my husband, why have you brought such a person? I mean, I said, this thing will snatch our baby and run away with it.
But Paul, Molly's husband, saw something special in John.
He was convincing everyone in the home that this boy will become somebody.
It didn't take long for John to win over Molly's heart.
I came back to my senses. I said, I must look after him like my own.
Molly tried to track down the boy's family. Around the village, a variety of stories circulated about John's father and mother. Eventually, Molly gathered enough information to piece together John's story. It all began in this house, now abandoned.
The mother had died, so the stepmother used to mistreat him. And somebody also said that this stepmother might have used some African charms to bewitch him, and he had to run away from home.
Just 4 years old, John snuck out of his house and ran into the darkness of the jungle. Molly believes it was here, nestled amongst the trees, alone and helpless, that John came face to face with the vervet monkeys. For John, as frightening as this experience must have been, running away from home was the beginning of a new life. Fast forward 12 years. John Sabunya is happily living with his new family. Now 17 years old, he still lives at the orphanage, but as the adopted son of Molly and Paul. In many ways, John is like any other teenage boy, hanging out with his friends, crazy about sports. In the years since he left the jungle, John has made tremendous progress. But to this day, he has trouble learning. John functions at the kindergarten level. He speaks and understands a little Luganda and English. But in other ways, John has excelled. His love for running led Molly and Paul to enter him in the Special Olympics. And it has become a driving force in his life. One of the key people in John's life is Solomon Mweba, who to this day acts as his big brother and mentor. Over the years, Solomon has learned to interpret John's broken language. John has become used to the urban world of Kampala. But we've asked Solomon to bring John back to the place where he was first found to see if he remembers anything about his time in the wild. John is a little nervous, but one thing he clearly remembers.
Well, we're here with John, and he's been trying to explain to me that this used to be his home. This is the very tree he was found, but it was a bit short when he could climb it. So this is the very tree where he was found.
Solomon asks what else he remembers.
John remembers more of the young monkeys, the small monkeys. He says that most of his time during the time, they were spending that time on eats. They were ever eating whatever they had.
The reality of being lost in the jungle would surely have been frightening for the boy. But that isn't what John seems to remember. Instead, it's playing with monkeys.
Well, John says that when he was with the small monkeys, they used to hide and each one had to go and look for another one. So they were playing. It was kind of their game. So that's the thing they used to do.
Eating and playing, what we might expect of the memories of a 4-year-old child. But are these memories real? Perhaps the more important question is, would monkeys finding a young child in the woods take care of him? It turns out John's not the only child allegedly raised by monkeys. In the early 1900s, a notorious story emerged from South Africa. The strange tale of Lucas the Baboon Boy. Near the small town of Kunap, police apprehended a feral boy they claimed to have found living among a troop of baboons. The officers said he behaved like a wild animal. He ran on all fours. He bit them, and he shrieked like a baboon. The boy was institutionalized and eventually put into the care of a local farmer who employed him as a farmhand and named him Lucas. But there's more. The same officers then declared they'd discovered the origins of this strange boy. Lucas, they said, had been stolen by baboons when he was just an infant from a remote village nearby. The case caused a sensation in the international media. Scientists were skeptical, but intrigued. Renowned anthropologist Dr. Raymond Dart even sent a colleague to Kunap to interview the now adult Lucas to see if there was anything behind the claims that Lucas was the real-life Tarzan of South Africa. But the idea of baboons raising a human infant sounds pretty far-fetched to 21st century experts, not least because we now know baboons can be fearsome predators and their troops enforce a strict social order. But what about other primates? There are several modern-day incidents caught on tape that suggest that higher primates might at least protect a child. In 1996, a 3-year-old boy fell into the gorilla pen at the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago. Keepers tried to drive the gorillas back from the unconscious child. The crowd watched in horror as they saw the dominant female of the group, Binti, pick him up. But instead of harming him, Binti protected the boy, holding him in her arms until human help arrived. Compelling images, but holding an unconscious child isn't the same as caring for another species. Dr. Stephen Sumi at the National Institute of Child and Human Development in Maryland studies the biobehavioral development of another primate species, rhesus monkeys. And to him, the idea of cross-species nurturing is at least a possibility.
We know that rhesus monkeys will form relationships with other animals. Dogs, wild cats, horses. So it's possible, I would think, in theory, for these monkeys to form relationships with people over the long term as well.
Dr. Sumi has observed a distinct pattern of response from the monkeys when it comes to human contact.
The monkeys that we study here know all of the caretakers, they know the veterinarians, they know the individuals who collect data. They make decisions regarding the gender of the human they're interacting with, so they're more cautious around adult males than they are around adult females. And they make great differences in terms of the age of the humans that they're interacting with.
And most interesting is the reaction of the rhesus to children.
When my staff members bring their young children to watch the monkeys over the weekend, the monkeys go crazy, the adult males go through rituals as if to try to entice these little kids to join their group, whereas they wouldn't give adult humans any bit of their time or energy.
But Ugandan expert Peter Appel is highly skeptical that any primate would nurture a human child in the wild. He thinks the zoo incident is an aberration.
From what I know about animal behavior, that is a very unique case, because their innate instinct would be to attack or kill this infant.
Peter Appel is a veterinarian and Ugandan wildlife specialist. He works with a variety of primates, including vervet monkeys, the species that supposedly cared for John. And Appel has a slightly less romantic explanation of how John survived with the monkeys.
Vervets are by nature a trash species. They collect much more than they could eat. So probably what happened in this instance is that John survived on the leftover food that the vervets must have been collecting and couldn't finish. John would probably pick what was left over of that.
This shifts the interpretation of the relationship between John and the monkeys. It was perhaps not the vervets that cared for John, but John who made use of them to survive. Peter tells us that there is a clear difference between tolerance and caretaking.
To be nurtured means that you will be fully accepted into the structure of the society. John being human, it's very unlikely that he was nurtured. He could have been accepted or even just tolerated. Nurturing is not possible.
But what led the 4-year-old boy to the monkeys in the first place? Human survival instincts? A need for food? Or was he in search of a hug? Part of the allure of the wild child myth is the bond that occurs between human and animal. It is what makes these stories so compelling. But will a child deprived of human contact substitute an animal for a parent? Several recent cases seem to suggest they would. In the early 1990s, a story emerged from the Ukraine of a young girl living on a rundown farm. Oksana Malaya, a girl apparently raised by dogs. According to this Russian television report, Oksana was only 3 when her alcoholic parents first left her outside with the dogs. For 5 years, Oksana slept in the kennel. She lived as a dog, running on all 4s, barking and eating with her canine companions. To observers, it seemed as though the young girl turned to the dogs for affection when her abusive parents failed her. Professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Charles Nelson III, believes they could be right. It may be that as humans, we're genetically programmed to seek affection, or at the very least, a stable relationship with another living thing.
The question of whether we're hardwired to seek affection is a very interesting one, and the answer seems to be yes. In the case of Oksana, if this little girl was just left with dogs, she's going to form a relationship with those dogs. If we have this biological imperative to form a relationship, if your only option is a dog, you'll form a relationship with the dog.
This biological imperative may well be a human survival mechanism. We're helpless at birth, but we're genetically programmed to ask for help. Because once we've engaged a caregiver, we're likely to get the stuff we need to survive, like food and warmth. So it's possible that absent a parent, a feral child interacts with an animal in the same way. John Sabunya sought company with the monkeys and got enough food to survive. Oksana Malaya looked for comfort from a pack of dogs. They provided warmth. Oksana was finally rescued at the age of 13 and placed in a foster home. But what effect does this kind of extreme experience have on a child? Modern science has discovered a young child's brain is highly impressionable. The developing brain cells are primed and ready to be sculpted into crucial neurological centers. One bundle of cells will become the language center. Others will govern the senses, emotions, personality. The sculptor is the youngster's environment, everything they see, hear, and experience. When you see a parent interacting with a child, not only are you seeing a happy baby, but you are seeing the brain at work, hardwiring healthy neurons to build a biologically balanced brain.
One of the things we know about brain development is that the brain depends critically on experiences. For it to grow and develop normally, it assumes that the environment is going to support it, presenting all kinds of experiences to the child. If those experiences are absent or abnormal, then you assume that the wiring of the brain has become abnormal or miswired.
The experiences Oksana was exposed to from age 3 were largely canine, and as a result, she learned to act and respond like a dog. In the case of John Sabunya, the 4-year-old appears to have lost critical learning and speech ability during his time in the jungle.
That sensitive period, those first 3 to 5 years, are really an essential point in development for the brain to get wired correctly. If the brain has been miswired early on, it's like having a bad foundation to a house.
Clearly, these experiences have a devastating effect on a child and a child's development. But in the case of Oksana, despite the appalling treatment she suffered from her parents, the young girl appears to have adjusted to her new environment. This 2001 interview with Russian television demonstrates Oksana has learned to speak, even if her words remind us of the horror of her life.
What makes you most happy?
I like to run around like a dog, to bark and howl.
Why?
It is my nature.
The fact is, scientists now understand that a child's brain has a remarkable capacity to adapt and even rewire, depending on the length and severity of the experience and the age at which it took place. So, what about John? As part of his work on feral children, Dr. Douglas Canlon has followed John Sabunya's progress for years. Dr. Canlon has returned to Uganda to re-interview John, the 17-year-old, to see what, if anything, he can remember about his time with the vervet monkeys. Canlon first met John about 6 years ago, when he was still a young boy and had difficulty communicating. So he's delighted to see John's lost his inhibitions and even become an entertainer. But as a scientist, Dr. Canlon still has questions about John's story.
People's first question is this a true story? Nobody has exactly the same story, but everybody has the same theme.
The recurring theme here, based on the memory of a 4-year-old, is that John ran away from his home and was adopted by the monkeys. Canlon wants to examine John's story from the perspective of an animal behaviorist, to ascertain how exactly John interacted with the vervets. He's asked John, with Solomon at his side, to piece together what he remembers.
When you lived in the forest, you said there were many animals there. Were there large animals as well as small animals?
He said that there were big monkeys and small monkeys. There were also snakes and antelope and some other animals.
Can you show me the monkeys that you saw there?
Well, he says that the first 2, he saw them.
John has no trouble identifying the vervets in a lineup, but Canlon wants to establish exactly how John fit into the complex hierarchy of the vervet community.
Vervet monkeys will spend the afternoon grooming each other. It's about establishing a relationship. It's kind of like talking among human beings. Did you groom monkeys?
Well, the monkeys groomed each other, but not John.
But not John.
Yeah, but not John.
That suggests John was a bystander, not a part of the monkey group. Next, Canlon tests the theory that John was not fed by the monkeys, but scavenged for their leftovers.
Do you mean they threw food and you collected it?
But John, at least according to Solomon, is emphatic on this point.
They collected food and brought food to him. Sometimes they could hand the food into his hand, but none of the monkeys got the food and threw the food away.
John and Solomon also try to convince Dr. Canlon that the monkeys actually brought water to him.
But this is how they made the thing, and they handed the water.
But it was the monkeys who made this, not John.
Not John.
The monkeys.
Dr. Canlon, a 40-year veteran of working with primates, is unconvinced. Few primates are capable of tool use, and vervets are not one of them.
Well, I think we are dealing here with some childhood memories that, like all childhood memories, become elaborated over time. I think he did spend much time with monkey troops. I think he did find food that they had cast aside. He may well have found banana leaves that were still had water in them from rainstorms and assumed that the animals themselves had done the fashioning. So when you ask, was John raised by monkeys, I prefer to say he was raised to some degree with monkeys, but I don't believe the monkeys reared him in the usual sense of that word.
In many ways, it appears John has survived his early experience of being lost in the jungle. But has he overcome the possibly more devastating tragedy in his life, the first years of his life, at the hands of the people who were supposed to have protected him? John Sabunya's obviously come a long way from his days in the jungle. The nurturing home of Molly and Paul Waswa has given him a second chance in life. But John still has difficulty with learning, coordination, and language. Is this because he was alone in the jungle during the crucial developmental stage when most children learn to speak? Or is there something else affecting John's recovery? We've asked Molly's permission and help to take John to get a complete brain scan in Uganda. At the International Medical Group in Kampala, John, a little nervous, undergoes a computed tomography scan that will produce images of the anatomy of his brain.
Do you see that site?
The scan might help identify any anomalies or possible damage done to the brain and help pinpoint the cause of John's continuing difficulty with learning. Dr. Jay Geed, a neuroscientist from the National Institute of Health in Maryland, will help analyze the results. Dr. Geed is one of the world's preeminent specialists in brain development research. And the results reveal something unexpected. In almost every way, John's brain is healthy and normal, except for one thing.
The most striking feature is this dark area right here. This is a pretty big area of damage, about the size of a grapefruit.
At some stage in his young life, John suffered a massive blow to the head.
A pretty major trauma to the brain.
The location of the trauma has important implications.
This part of the brain is ground zero for language function. Understanding language, learning language, it's almost completely wiped out here. Just looking at the picture, not even knowing anything about John, I'd say, this is a person who's probably going to have a lot of difficulty with language. But the good news is much of the rest of the brain is fine. And so this should allow John to enjoy life and to have an imagination and to have social interactions.
A critical question about this injury is, when did it occur?
If the damage to the brain happens very early in brain development, then there's still a chance for the brain to find alternate routes, alternate connections, alternate wiring. But if the damage happens after that's already in place, then it's much more difficult to recover function. And in looking at John's brain scans, it looks to be that the second one happened, that the wiring was already established for the language centers and then was damaged.
Perhaps we'll never know exactly when John received this injury, but one thing we do know is that the trauma to John's head in early life, not the effects of living in the wild, are the cause of the language difficulties John has today. What John Sabunya's case demonstrates is that trying to determine the effect of living in the wild is only half of the story. The other half is discovering what got these children there in the first place.
Collectively, when I think of these feral children, it just brings to mind abuse and neglect. These children wind up living in the wild because they fled a bad situation. And that makes it more difficult to understand how that living in the wild will affect their brain development or the behavioral development because they led off life with a pretty bad beginning.
That was clearly the case for Oksana, neglected by her alcoholic, dysfunctional parents. And while we don't know exactly what happened in that house in Uganda, there's a very real possibility John was physically abused and driven out of his home. On closer examination, many famous feral children cases come down to parents who have abandoned their unwanted children. This may in fact have been what happened to Victor of Aveyron. In Dr. Itard's notes, he mentions a straight-edge scar on the boy's throat. Perhaps someone took the young child out into the woods and tried to end his life. Historically, it was not uncommon for parents to abandon children born with mental or physical disabilities. That most certainly is the explanation behind one famous case, that of Lucas, the boy allegedly raised by baboons. On closer inspection, scientists uncovered a complete fabrication. Severely handicapped, the boy had been abandoned by his family at birth and spent his early years in various institutions before running away at about 13 years old.
The baboon story was clearly a fabrication that had been imposed on the reality of a child with severe disabilities or abnormalities.
And once the rumor that he'd been raised by baboons got started, everyone got a piece of the action. For years, the farmer George Smith and the officers that found him perpetuated the myth, cashing in on the sensational story. There is a similar explanation behind the other famous case of the time, that of Amala and Kamala in India. The reported story is that the Reverend Singh found the girls living with wolves in the jungle of Bengal, but later interviews with the local villagers reveal a very different story.
It turned out that he came through with a hunting party every year at the same time. Told the villagers he was looking for orphans to take to his orphanage. It doesn't take too much imagination to imagine some parents saying, "We have two badly retarded daughters who are going to be a huge drain on our limited resources, and this man is offering to take them to an orphanage." So what might happen is that they were left in a place where the fellow huntsman knew to find them, and everybody's happy.
So how to explain the fact that the Reverend Singh wrote a long, dramatic account of fighting the wolves for the children? Adriana Benzaken thinks Reverend Singh's motives were simple.
He had a group of children that he was responsible for, and the orphanage was always short of cash, yeah? And perhaps by saying that two of his children were wolf children and bringing attention and money into the orphanage might have been a motive.
So it seems the backstory of each feral child is never simple. Some are pure hoaxes, such as the kangaroo girl created as a publicity stunt in Australia. Others are tragic cases of abused or disabled children, transformed into sensational stories by the media, or misused by an overzealous scientific community looking for answers.
Claiming that a child is a wild child is never innocent. Usually there is an investment in that, there is an interest. Either you want to study that child, or you want to exploit that child to somehow bring attention to your cause. There's always a motive behind it.
Oksana, Victor, John Sabunya. The real story here is the abuse and neglect they suffered at the hands of their human caretakers. Perhaps the myth of the wild child reflects our inability to accept the failings of our own so-called civilized society. While John Sabunya's childhood was undeniably tragic, his future looks promising. John keeps busy competing in the Special Olympics and performing with the Pearl of Africa Children's Choir. To much of the world, he will always be known as Uganda's famous wild child. But the real story here is a young man's resilience and grace against incredible odds.